There comes a moment on every journey, not when you've reached the destination, but when you finally realize you're no longer the person who first began the journey. 6 conversations, 6 invitations, 6 foundations. We began with identity, fortitude and focus, wisdom and discipline. Each episode has been preparing us for this one, because once you've learned who you are, once you've learned to stand, once you've learned to trust God with your path, another question quietly emerges. How do you learn to see? Welcome back to Beyond the Frame. Today's conversation begins with something simple, a picture. Probably have heard a picture's worth 1,000 words. It can capture a smile, a reunion, a storm rolling across the sea. One photograph can hold an entire story. But today, I'm less interested in the picture and more interested in the frame, because every picture has one, a boundary, an edge, something that quietly tells us this is where everything is. What if our lives work the same way? What if every one of us is living inside a frame we never chose? A frame built from our childhood, our disappointments, our fears, our successes, our culture, our emotions, even our sense, and somewhere along the way, quietly assumed that the edge of our frame was the edge of reality. More than 2,000 years ago, there was a philosopher by the name of Plato. He imagined a cave, and inside the cave, there were prisoners. These prisoners were chained. Since birth, they couldn't turn around. They couldn't see behind them. And what they could see were shadows dancing on the wall. For them, the shadows were not symbols. They were not part of reality. They were reality to them. Until one prisoner was put aside, saw sunlight, trees, mountains, and people. And in that moment, he realized everything he had called reality had only ever been a shadow. The cave wasn't the world, it was just a frame. Imagine that. All their lives from birth, they thought what they saw, the shadows they saw on the cave, was reality. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound like how things work? Or is it just a story? Centuries later, another Stoic echoed a similar warning. You should not trust every impression. Don't assume your emotions always tell the truth. Don't mistake appearances for reality. Wisdom, it begins with humility, with admitting, I may not be seeing the whole picture. These are different philosophies, but they have one common warning. Be careful that what you see does not become your prison. I wonder how often we've done that exactly. How many of us have mistakenly anxiety for reality, success for failing? How many of us have allowed every painful experience to become the frame through which we interpret every relationship, or every story, or every step which we take in our lives? How many of us have looked at one closed door and concluded God must have abandoned us? Perhaps the frame has become smaller than the world God is inviting us into. Scripture begins with, let there be light. There was darkness, sky, the sea, land, everything received its place, its purpose, its order. Creation itself tells us something about God. He doesn't create chaos, He brings order. Then He created man. Humanity enters the story. Humanity was created in His own image, not to survive in creation, but to know the Creator. We all have heard of Adam and Eve. We hear about the story. Their life was surrounded by abundance, every tree, every provision, every need supplied, and most importantly, they walked with God. But then, the serpent spoke. Notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't remove God's blessings. It redirects their attention. Thousands of gifts suddenly disappeared behind one forbidden tree. The frame becomes smaller. Abundance becomes scarcity. It becomes suspicion. Nothing around them had changed, only the frame through which they were looking. And perhaps that's still how temptations work. It doesn't always remove God's goodness. It simply convinces us to stop seeing it. Generations later, we hear about how the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. They watched as the walls of the water stand on either side, and they passed on dry ground. After they passed, the water collapsed and they drowned those who were chasing them. They witnessed miracles, provision, deliverance, the very presence of God. Yet only weeks later, they built a golden calf because fear narrowed their frame. The God they could not see suddenly seemed less real than the idol they could touch. The frame became smaller. Again, how often do we do the same? We trust God when life makes sense. But then, when things started looking uncertain, and suddenly we reach for something we can't control, achievement, money, status, relationship, comfort. None of those things are evil in themselves, but they become dangerous when they replace the God who has already proven himself faithful. This brings us to one of the most remarkable ideas shared between Stoicism and Christianity, the Logos. The Stoics believed the Logos was the rational principle that ordered the universe. Everything followed it. Everything was determined by it. The wise person simply accepted their place within its order. There is beauty in that thought. It recognizes that life is not random, that creation is design. But then, in the book of John opened this gospel where that would have astonished both Greek philosophers and Jewish readers alike. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was God. Then comes the sentence that changes everything. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. The force behind creation was not an idea. It was not a law anymore. It was not a reason. The Logos has a face, a voice, a name. The Stoics said, submit yourself to order of the universe. And Jesus says, follow me. One offers acceptance of fate. The other offers relationship with the Creator. One teaches endurance. The other offers presence. In the book of Hebrews, we hear about faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is not pretending reality doesn't exist. Faith is not recognizing that reality is bigger than what your eyes currently perceive. Faith says, my circumstances are real, but they are not ultimate. Faith says, I cannot see the whole picture, but I trust the one who stands outside the frame. Perhaps that's why Paul reminds us, we walk by faith and not by sight. Not because sight is bad, but because sight alone becomes another frame. So let me leave you with one question. What frame are you living inside today? Has fear become your frame? Has disappointment become your frame? Has success become your frame? Has shame become your frame? Have you mistaken one chapter for the entire story? Perhaps God hasn't been absent. Perhaps you've simply been looking at a smaller picture. Present doesn't always announce itself with miracles. Sometimes it whispers. In ordinary morning, in forgiveness, in daily bread, in the quiet conviction that you're not walking alone. Maybe that's what it means to live beyond the frame, to recognize that God has always been present, even when your frame was too small to notice Him. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond the Frame. Until next time, keep seeking truth, keep walking by faith, and remember, the story God is writing is always bigger than the frame you're holding today.
They say seeing is believing, but what if believing is the thing that finally teaches you to see? Marcus Aurelius wrote in the dark by candlelight to no one but himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, you'll find strength. But strength was never meant to be the final room in the house. It was meant to be the hallway, leading somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, somewhere only the still can enter. Elijah learned this on the mountain. The wind tore the rocks apart, but God wasn't in it. The earthquake shook the ground, but God wasn't in it. Fire fell from heaven, but God wasn't in it. Then a whisper, a still small voice, and Elijah finally understood. God doesn't always shout. Sometimes He waits until you're quiet enough to hear Him. That's presence, not the absence of noise, but the awakening of the eyes that finally see. The Stoics taught us to master ourselves, but the Psalms whisper something deeper. Be still and know, not to do more, not to push harder. Be still, because maybe the mountain wasn't testing your endurance. Maybe it was training your attention. The bread on your table this morning, ordinary, but it's provision. The friend who called at the exact right time, ordinary, but it's an answered prayer wearing a disguise. The sunrise, ordinary, but it's mercy, new every morning. You didn't build this foundation just to stand on your own. You built them so you finally become still enough to notice who's been walking beside you all along. Open your eyes, He was never hiding. You were simply moving too fast to see Him in the ordinary. So today, before you rush into tomorrow, pause, look again, notice the blessing you've been overlooking. Thank God for an ordinary moment that isn't ordinary at all. And if you're ready to understand how God speaks most clearly in the silence, stay with me for the next reflection. Because sometimes His greatest work begins when it feels like nothing is happening. Until then, keep noticing His presence in the ordinary.